In the late spring of 605 BC, near the ancient city of Carchemish on the upper Euphrates River, an army approached from the south. It was the Babylonian forces under the command of Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar. They were marching to meet the combined armies of Egypt and the remnants of the Assyrian Empire. The Egyptian pharaoh Necho II had marched north to support Assyria, the former dominant power now crumbling after the fall of its capital Nineveh 7 years earlier. Everything seemed poised for a decisive confrontation. The Babylonians had been pressing westward, and this battle would determine who controlled the Levant. Only a few hours later, something was decided. The Egyptian army was routed. Necho II fled. The Assyrian remnants were destroyed. The Babylonian victory at Carchemish was complete. What happened? The battle was not just a military engagement. It was the culmination of decades of shifting alliances and wars that had reshaped the ancient Near East. The Assyrian Empire had ruled with brutal efficiency for centuries, but by the late 7th century BC, it was in terminal decline. A coalition of Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and others had sacked Nineveh in 612 BC, shattering Assyrian power. The Egyptians, fearing the rise of Babylon, allied with the remaining Assyrian forces. Pharaoh Necho II intended to prop up Assyria as a buffer state, but the young Babylonian crown prince Nebuchadnezzar had other plans. He struck first at Carchemish, destroying the Egyptian army and securing Babylonian dominance over Syria and Palestine. The victory at Carchemish made Nebuchadnezzar a king. His father Nabopolassar died shortly after the battle, and Nebuchadnezzar returned to Babylon to claim the throne. He would reign for over 40 years, from 605 to 562 BC. Under his rule, Babylon became the most magnificent city of the ancient world. He rebuilt the city's walls, gates, temples, and palaces. He constructed the Ishtar Gate, adorned with glazed blue bricks and reliefs of dragons and bulls. He built the royal palace with its throne room and gardens. But among all his works, none is more famous than the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But what were the Hanging Gardens? And did they exist at all? Ancient Greek historians describe the gardens as an extraordinary feat of engineering, a series of terraced gardens rising high above the city, planted with trees and flowers from across the empire, watered by an elaborate irrigation system that drew from the Euphrates River. They said the gardens were built by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife Amydes, who missed the green hills of her homeland in Media. The gardens were said to be about 400 feet square and over 80 feet high, with stone columns and archways supporting heavy soil and vegetation. Contemporaneous Babylonian records, however, are silent on the gardens. There is no cuneiform tablet that mentions them. No inscription from Nebuchadnezzar himself describes such a structure. This silence has led some historians to doubt whether the Hanging Gardens ever existed in Babylon. Investigators, or rather archaeologists and historians, have searched for evidence. Excavations of Babylon in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey uncovered the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, including a strange structure with thick walls and a series of vaulted chambers. Koldewey believed this could have been the base of the Hanging Gardens, but later analysis suggested it might have been a storeroom or a different type of building. More recent scholarship proposes that the gardens might have actually been built in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, by King Sennacherib a century earlier. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe a magnificent garden with aqueducts and water-lifting screws that brought water from the Tigris. The confusion may have arisen because later Greek writers, writing hundreds of years after the fact, misattributed the gardens to Babylon. The question remains, were the Hanging Gardens ever there? And if so, where exactly were they? Meanwhile, the kings of the Babylonian Empire are often remembered only through one figure, Nebuchadnezzar II, but there were others before and after him whose reigns shaped the empire and its eventual fall. These are the forgotten kings. The founder of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father. In 626 BC, he led a rebellion against Assyrian rule and established an independent Babylonian kingdom. Over the next 2 decades, he fought to consolidate his power, culminating in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. He is often overshadowed by his more famous son, but without Nabopolassar, there would have been no Babylonian Empire. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the empire passed through a series of short-lived rulers. His son Emil-Marduk, also known as Evil Merodach in the Bible, reigned only 2 years before being assassinated. He was succeeded by Neriglissar, a general who may have been involved in the coup. Neriglissar also reigned briefly, about 4 years, and was followed by his son Labashi-Marduk, who was murdered within months. Then came Nabonidus, the final king of Babylon, who would reign for 17 years, from 556 to 539 BC. Nabonidus is one of the most enigmatic and forgotten kings of Babylon. He was not a Babylonian born, but an Aramean or Assyrian descendant who rose to power through the military or priesthood. He was a scholar, an archaeologist before the term existed, who restored ancient temples and revived old cults. But he also sparked controversy by elevating the moon god Sin over Babylon's chief god Marduk. This religious policy alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk in Babylon itself. Furthermore, Nabonidus spent most of his reign not in Babylon, but in the oasis city of Tama in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in his place. Why he did this is unclear. Some suggest he was fleeing political opposition, others that he was pursuing trade routes or religious devotion. But his absence from Babylon during a time of growing threat from the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great was a critical mistake. The system failed. The Babylonian Empire, for all its military strength and monumental architecture, had a fragile political structure. Succession was often violent. Kings were frequently overthrown or assassinated. The priesthood held immense power, and when Nabonidus alienated them, he lost his support base. The empire's defenses, while formidable, relied on a network of vassals and alliances that could dissolve. When Cyrus the Great marched into Mesopotamia in 539 BC, he faced little resistance. According to the Cyrus Cylinder, the Babylonians welcomed him because Nabonidus had angered them. The city of Babylon fell without a major battle. The Persian king entered the city, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. What investigators of history have found is a pattern of internal decay masked by external glory. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was a wonder, but it was also a state built on conquest, slavery, and a rigid hierarchy. The Hanging Gardens, real or imagined, symbolize the peak of that civilization. But the Forgotten Kings remind us that empires are not just the work of one great ruler. They are built and undone by many hands, many decisions, many fractures. Why does this still matter? The Babylonian Empire left a profound legacy. The law code of Hammurabi, from the earlier Old Babylonian period, influenced legal thought for millennia. Babylonian astronomy and mathematics laid the groundwork for Greek science. The story of the Tower of Babel, based on the ziggurat of Babylon, echoes in religious tradition. The theme of a great empire that fell because of overreach and internal division is a cautionary tale, and the mystery of the Hanging Gardens continues to attract researchers and dreamers, a symbol of human ingenuity and the fragility of memory. To understand the scale of Nebuchadnezzar's ambitions, one must look at his military campaigns. After Carchemish, he pushed south into Egypt, though he did not conquer it. He suppressed rebellions in the Levant, most notably in Jerusalem. In 597 BC, he besieged the city after King Jehoiachin refused to pay tribute. The Babylonian king deported the young king, his court, and thousands of artisans and soldiers to Babylon. 10 years later, in 586 BC, after another rebellion supported by Egypt, Nebuchadnezzar returned. He besieged Jerusalem for 18 months. The walls were breached. The Temple of Solomon was burned. The city was destroyed. The remaining population was carried into exile to Babylon. This event is recorded in the Hebrew Bible, in the Book of Kings and the Book of Jeremiah, and in the Babylonian Chronicles. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian captivity became a defining trauma for the Jewish people, shaping their religion, literature, and identity for centuries. Nebuchadnezzar did not only destroy, he built with the labor and wealth from his conquests. The Ishtar Gate was completed around 575 BC. It was a massive double gate on the northern side of the city, leading from the processional way. The gate was covered in blue glazed bricks with alternating rows of dragons and bulls, symbols of the gods Marduk and Adad. The processional way itself was an 80-foot wide avenue lined with walls decorated with lions in brick relief. During the New Year festival, statues of the gods were carried along this road into the temple of Marduk. The ziggurat of Babylon, often identified with the biblical Tower of Babel, stood next to the temple. It was called Etemenenki, meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth. It rose over 90 meters high, a 7-tiered structure that dominated the skyline. The hanging gardens, if they existed, were part of this building program. The Greek historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC, claimed Nebuchadnezzar built them to please his wife Amydes. But Berossus was a Babylonian priest writing under Greek rule, and his account may have been colored by later legends. The gardens are described by Herodotus, but his description of Babylon is sometimes fanciful. Strabo, writing in the 1st century AD, gave a more detailed account. The gardens consisted of brick vaults and terraces, irrigated by screws that lifted water from the Euphrates. But Strabo was writing 500 years after Nebuchadnezzar's time. No native Babylonian source confirms any of this. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The gardens could have been destroyed or their records lost, but the silence is striking. In 1899, Robert Coldewey began excavating Babylon. He uncovered the Ishtar Gate, the palace, and a structure he called the Wonder Building, a vaulted basement of thick walls that he thought supported the gardens. But later excavations revealed that the vaults were likely part of a storage facility or a water reservoir. The walls were not load-bearing for gardens. The alternative theory that the gardens were in Nineveh gains traction from the detailed inscriptions of Sennacherib. He wrote that he built a garden that imitated the Amanus Mountains, with cypresses, cedars, and fruit trees, watered by a canal and bronze water screws. The garden was on a raised terrace and was visible from the palace. The description matches the Greek accounts of the hanging gardens. Sennacherib's garden was also destroyed when Nineveh fell in 612 BC. The confusion may have happened because later writers, like Berossus, conflated Sennacherib's garden with Babylon, or because the term hanging gardens became generic for any grand terraced garden. The forgotten kings of Babylon also have their mysteries. Nebuchadnezzar's reign produced many inscriptions, but his successors left fewer records. Marduk is mentioned in the Bible as releasing King Jehoiachin from prison, but his assassination suggests political intrigue. Neriglissar campaigned in Cilicia and built temples, but his reign was brief. Marduk was a child ruler, and the aristocracy killed him quickly. Then came Nabonidus, whose long reign was marked by unusual actions. Nabonidus had a mother, Adad-Gupi, who was a priestess of the moon god Sin in Haran. She lived to be over 100 years old and influenced his religious policies. Nabonidus restored the temple of Sin in Haran, which had been destroyed by the Medes. He also built a temple in Babylon to Sin, provoking the Marduk priesthood. He called himself the servant of Sin, not Marduk. This was a direct challenge to the traditional Babylonian state religion. The religious tension weakened his rule. His self-imposed exile to Tama in Arabia from 553 to 542 BC is poorly understood. He established a military base there, controlled trade routes, and built temples. Some think he was investigating mineral resources, others that he was avoiding the political turmoil in Babylon. But during his absence, the Persian threat grew. Cyrus the Great had unified the Persians and Medes and was conquering Lydia and the Greek city-states of Ionia. By 539 BC, he was ready to move against Babylon. The fall of Babylon is described in the book of Daniel, with the story of Belshazzar's feast, where a hand wrote on the wall. Historically, the Persian army diverted the Euphrates River and entered the city through the river gates, which had been left open or poorly guarded. The city was not sacked. Cyrus presented himself as a liberator. He restored the cult of Marduk and allowed the deported peoples, including the Jews, to return home. Nabonidus was captured and exiled, but not killed. Belshazzar may have died fighting. The legacy of Babylon is complex. Its art and architecture influenced the Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The Hanging Gardens became a symbol of lost wonders. The Forgotten Kings remind us that history is full of gaps, misattributions, and silence. The question of the gardens remains open. But the more we dig, the more we realize that what we think we know about ancient Babylon is often built on later legends and partial evidence. The story is not just about what was built, but about what was remembered and what was forgotten. On the 14th of March, 1899, a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey arrived at a dusty mound on the Euphrates River, about 50 miles south of modern Baghdad. The site had been known for centuries as Babel, a scattering of low hills littered with broken brick and pottery. Local villagers had long used the ancient bricks for building, and travelers had described the ruins since the Middle Ages. But Koldewey was the first to bring systematic excavation to the place the Assyrians once called Babylu, the Gate of the Gods. He had a specific mission: to uncover the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the Great Walls, the Ishtar Gate, and if possible, the Hanging Gardens. He had a budget, a team of workmen, and a conviction that the remains of one of the most famous cities in history lay just beneath the sand. Koldewey began digging on the Kasser Mound, the largest hill which he believed covered the royal palace. Within months, he uncovered massive brick walls, some as thick as 10 meters. They were made of sun-dried mud brick, common in Mesopotamia, but the scale was staggering. By 1902, he had exposed the foundations of a monumental structure he identified as Nebuchadnezzar's southern palace. Among the debris, he found fragments of glazed bricks in deep blue, yellow, and white. These were the remains of the Ishtar Gate, which had been dismantled by later builders and reused as foundations. Koldewey's workmen also uncovered a long avenue lined with the same glazed bricks, decorated with reliefs of striding lions. This was the processional way. Yet for all his success, Koldewey found nothing that matched the Greek descriptions of the Hanging Gardens. He did discover a large vaulted building near the palace, which he called the Wonder Building because of its unusual construction. It had thick walls, a deep well, and a system of water channels. He believed this was the substructure of the gardens, a sort of basement that had supported the terraces above. His identification remained popular for decades, but later archaeologists and engineers examined the building more carefully. The vaults were too small to support a massive garden. The walls were not built to carry the weight of deep soil and water. The water channels likely served a different purpose, perhaps a reservoir or a bathing facility. By the early 2000s, the wonder building theory was largely abandoned. The gardens, if they ever existed in Babylon, remained hidden. What happened? The question of the Hanging Gardens is not a single archaeological puzzle. It is a tangle of texts, translations, and assumptions. The earliest Greek descriptions come from Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote after Alexander the Great conquered the region. His work, the Babyloniaca, has survived only in fragments quoted by later authors. Berossus claimed that Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens to remind his wife Amydes of her homeland in Media. The story is vivid, but Berossus was writing 3 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's death. He may have been repeating a folk tale or conflating Babylon with another city. The other major sources are Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, both writing in the 1st century BC or AD. They describe a garden made of stone vaults, irrigated by screws lifting water from the Euphrates, but neither visited Babylon. They relied on earlier Greek accounts, now lost. No native Babylonian inscription, no clay tablet, no royal stele from Nebuchadnezzar or any other king mentions a hanging garden. This silence is the central problem. In 1994, an Oxford scholar named Stephanie Dalley proposed a new hypothesis. She argued that the Hanging Gardens were not in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, which fell in 612 BC. Nineveh had been sacked and burned, but its ruins were still visible to Greek travelers. Dalley pointed to the inscriptions of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who reigned from 705 to 681 BC. Sennacherib boasted that he built a palace and a garden that imitated the Amanus Mountains. He described a system of bronze water screws, which he used to lift water from the Tigris River into a park on a raised terrace. He called it a wonder for all peoples. Dalley also noted that the Assyrians called Nineveh the Old Babylon, a term that could have confused later Greek writers. The Greek word for hanging, kremastos, could also be translated as suspended or raised, and the Assyrian reliefs depict trees on top of arched structures. The evidence is circumstantial, but it fits the known facts better than the Babylon theory. No trace of a massive garden has been found in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Sennacherib's Nineveh, on the other hand, has clear archaeological evidence of an elaborate water supply system and a large park. By 2015, Dalley's theory had gained wide acceptance, though not universal agreement. Some scholars hold that the gardens could have been in Babylon but were destroyed or built in a part of the city that has not been excavated. Others argue that the descriptions are simply legendary, not meant to be taken literally. The truth is that we may never know for certain. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, as described by the Greeks, are a literary construct as much as a historical one. They have been embellished by poets, painters, and filmmakers for 2,000 years. The real gardens of Mesopotamia, whether in Nineveh or Babylon, were probably more impressive than any surviving description. They were engineered irrigation systems that transformed a dry plain into a green mountain. They were statements of royal power, not just gardens, and they were ultimately lost. The forgotten kings of the Neo-Babylonian Empire are another layer of the same story. Nebuchadnezzar left behind a vast archive of administrative tablets, building inscriptions, and royal decrees. His reign is well documented. The same cannot be said for his successors. After his death in 562 BC, the throne passed to Amil-Marduk, his son. Amil-Marduk reigned for only 2 years. The Babylonian chronicles record that he was assassinated in a palace coup in 560 BC. The motive is unclear. The Bible mentions that Amil-Marduk released the Jewish king Jehoiachin from prison and gave him a pension, an act of clemency that may have angered the military or the priesthood. The assassins then placed Neriglissar on the throne. Neriglissar was a powerful nobleman, possibly a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. He conducted a campaign into Cilicia, modern Turkey, to protect trade routes and secure tribute. He built temples and restored the walls of Babylon. He died of natural causes in 556 BC. His son Labashi-Marduk was a child, and the Babylonian aristocracy murdered him within 9 months. The throne then passed to a man named Nabonidus, who was not related to the previous kings. Nabonidus is the most unusual of the forgotten kings. He reigned from 556 to 539 BC, a period of 17 years. He left many inscriptions, but they are puzzling. He was a devout follower of the moon god Sin, a deity whose cult had faded in Babylon. The chief god of Babylon was Marduk, and the powerful Marduk priesthood controlled the Esagila temple. Nabonidus did not suppress Marduk, but he elevated Sin in ways that were seen as heretical. He restored the temple of Sin in Haran, a city that had been destroyed by the Medes. He built a new temple for Sin in the city of Ur. He referred to himself as the servant of Sin, not Marduk. This caused tension from the start. In 553 BC, Nabonidus did something that historians still debate. He left Babylon and traveled to the oasis of Tama in the Arabian desert, about 700 miles to the south. He stayed there for 10 years. He did not abdicate, but he appointed his son Belshazzar as regent in Babylon. Why he chose to leave is unknown. Some suggest he was investigating mineral resources or trade routes. Others think he was avoiding the political opposition in Babylon. Still others propose he was ill or seeking religious solitude. The Babylonian chronicle for this period is fragmentary, but it records that the New Year festival, the most important religious ceremony, was not celebrated during his absence. The festival required the king to lead the procession of Marduk. Without the king, the festival could not happen. This was perceived as a grave insult to Marduk. The priesthood grew hostile. The people may have seen Nabonidus as a failed ruler. Meanwhile, a new power was emerging to the east. Cyrus the Persian, ruler of Anshan, had united the Persians and the Medes. He conquered Lydia in 546 BC, absorbing the wealth and resources of Croesus. He then turned his attention to the rich lands of Mesopotamia. The Babylonian army was well trained, but the empire was divided. Nabonidus returned from Tama in 542 BC, possibly to face the crisis. He attempted to restore the traditional cults and bring the gods of outlying cities into Babylon to protect them. He even brought the images of Sin and other gods from Haran to Babylon. But the Marduk priesthood, according to a later document known as the verse account of Nabonidus, actively sought the Persian invasion. The text, written after the Persian conquest, is propaganda, but it may contain a kernel of truth. In 539 BC, Cyrus invaded. The Battle of Opis on the Tigris River ended in a Babylonian defeat. The Persian army then marched to Sippar, which fell without resistance. The general Gobryas entered Babylon on the 12th of October 539 BC, according to the Babylonian chronicle. The city gates were opened by Persian sympathizers. The river gates had been left open, or the river was diverted. Cyrus himself entered the city a few days later. He presented himself as a liberator who restored peace and worship. He allowed the deported peoples to return home, including the Jews. Nabonidus was captured and exiled to Carmania, where he died years later. Belshazzar, the regent, may have died in the siege. The Book of Daniel records a banquet on the night Babylon fell, with a hand writing on the wall. The historical record is less dramatic but no less significant. The forgotten kings were not simply weak or incompetent. They were caught in a larger shift. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was built on conquest and tribute. It depended on the loyalty of provincial governors, the cooperation of temple elites, and the stability of a system that had worked for Nebuchadnezzar. But after his death, the system began to strain. The religious conflict over Nabonidus's policies was not just a personal quirk. It reflected a deeper struggle between centralizing royal power and the traditional autonomy of temple cities. The economic burden of maintaining Babylon's massive building projects and its army may have drained resources. The Persian Empire offered a different model: religious tolerance, administrative efficiency, and a vast network of roads and trade. The transition was swift and, for many, welcome. Why does this still matter? The fall of Babylon is a turning point in world history. It ended the great empires of the ancient Near East and created the conditions for the rise of Persia, which would later collide with Greece. The reign of Nabonidus is a case study in how religious policy can destabilize a state. The mystery of the Hanging Gardens reminds us that historical evidence is never complete. The most famous monument of the ancient world may have been in the wrong city. The forgotten kings are a lesson in the fragility of memory. They built temples and walls, but their names are known only to specialists. The empire they ruled is remembered for one king and one garden, neither of which may be exactly as the stories tell. In the years after Coldwey's excavations, the site of Babylon suffered further damage. The Saddam Hussein regime rebuilt parts of the city in the 198 using modern bricks and copying ancient patterns. The Ishtar Gate was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The ruins themselves were neglected. During the Iraq War of 2003, coalition forces established a military base on the site. Helicopter landings, heavy vehicles, and digging damaged the fragile layers. The ancient walls that had survived for 2,000 years were cracked and bulldozed. By 2009, UNESCO declared the site a World Heritage Site, but the damage had already been done. The forgotten kings would have understood. Empires fall, and what remains is often what later people choose to remember. The Hanging Gardens, whether in Babylon or Nineveh, stand as a symbol of that selective memory. The Greeks remembered them because they were strange, beautiful, and lost. They became a topos, a literary set piece that authors could embellish with details. The real engineers and slaves who built them have no tombstone. The forgotten kings have no epics. Their names are scratched on cuneiform tablets that were buried for millennia. And when they were unearthed, they were interpreted through the lens of the Bible and Greek myth. The attempt to find the gardens has been, in a way, an attempt to recover something that may never have existed in the form we expect. It is a search for a ghost, but the search itself has value. It forces archaeologists to examine the evidence with rigor. It challenges assumptions about what is exotic and what is ordinary. It connects the modern world to the ancient one through the same desire to understand. And it reminds us that history is not a single story. It is a conversation between the past and the present, a conversation that is always incomplete. The Babylonian Empire ended more than 2,000 years ago. Its bricks have been carried away for new buildings, its canals have dried up, its gods are dead, but the questions it raises are still alive. How do we build lasting cities? How do we treat conquered peoples? How do we write our own history? The forgotten kings and the missing gardens are not just footnotes. They are cracks in the facade of certainty. And through those cracks, we see the real Babylon, not the one of legend, but the one that struggled, built, worshipped, and fell. The night is quiet over the Euphrates. The Mound of Babel is dark. Somewhere beneath the sand, there may be a brick with a king's name, a garden's root, or a story that no one has read. The forgotten kings are still waiting. On the 24th of November 1998, a paper was published in the journal Greece and Rome. Its author was Stephanie Daly, an Assyriologist at the University of Oxford. The paper proposed a radical solution to one of the oldest mysteries in archaeology. It argued that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were not in Babylon. They were in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib around 700 BC. The paper was based on a close reading of Akkadian texts, including a description by Sennacherib himself of a palace with a park that used a water-lifting device. The paper was concise, but its implications were massive. For 2,000 years, the Hanging Gardens had been attributed to Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. Now, a single academic article challenged that. What happened? Daly had begun questioning the traditional attribution years earlier. The first clue was geographical. The Greek authors who described the Hanging Gardens, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, and Philo of Byzantium, gave details about the water source. They described a screw-like device, the Archimedes screw, used to lift water from the Euphrates. But the Euphrates at Babylon was not the right height for such a system. Nineveh, on the other hand, had an elaborate canal network carved into the hills. The second clue was textual. The historian Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 300 BC, never specifically mentioned the gardens. He wrote about Nebuchadnezzar building a hanging paradise, but the wording was ambiguous. Later authors may have exaggerated. The third clue was archaeological. Excavations at Babylon by Robert Coldwell in the early 20th century found a structure with vaulted arches that some thought was the garden foundation. But that structure was later identified as a storehouse. No soil traces, no root systems, no water channels were found. At Nineveh, however, the remains of Sennacherib's palace included a massive aqueduct system, a water screw, and reliefs showing a garden with trees and streams. The evidence was circumstantial but consistent. How could this have been missed? The answer lies in the history of scholarship. When the Seven Wonders were canonized in the Hellenistic period, Babylon was already a ruined city of legend. The Greeks had access to Babylonian lore through Berossus and through travelers. They may have conflated two famous gardens, one in Babylon, one in Nineveh. The name, Hanging Gardens of Babylon, stuck because Babylon was more famous. Assyrian kings like Sennacherib were largely forgotten after Nineveh fell in 612 BC. Their records were buried. When Assyriologists began translating cuneiform tablets in the 19th century, they found Sennacherib's descriptions of his palace with no rival and its accompanying park. But they did not connect it to the Hanging Gardens because the connection was not obvious. The assumption that the gardens must be in Babylon was so strong that contradictory evidence was either dismissed or reinterpreted. What investigators found when they looked deeper was a pattern of misattribution. Classical authors such as Josephus, who quoted Berossus, had already blurred the line. Over centuries, writers added details: the mountainous terrain, the use of brick and bitumen, the queen who missed her homeland. None of these details matched the flat, alluvial plain of Babylon, but they matched the environment of Nineveh, which is near the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The water-lifting device, an endless screw, was described by Philo of Byzantium in the 2nd century BC. That type of screw is efficient for lifting water a moderate height. At Babylon, the water would have to be lifted over 30 meters to reach the top of a palace garden. At Nineveh, the source was an aqueduct from the mountains, and the lift needed was much smaller. The screw had been used in Assyria earlier. It may have been invented there. The missed signal was on every page of the ancient texts, but it required someone to read them with fresh eyes. Why does this still matter? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders. If they were actually in Nineveh, then the list is geographically incorrect. That may seem minor, but it reflects how history is shaped by survival of sources. The Greek writers had access to Babylonian stories because Babylonia was part of the Persian and later Hellenistic empires. Assyrian sources were buried under the ruins of Nineveh. The forgotten kings of Assyria, Sennacherib and his successors, built some of the most impressive hydraulic structures of the ancient world, yet their name is not on the wonder list. Meanwhile, the forgotten kings of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's immediate successors, are remembered mainly as footnotes. The Hanging Gardens, if they ever existed in any form, became the defining monument of a city that had many others. The Ishtar Gate, the Ziggurat Etemenenki, the massive city walls. Those real achievements were overshadowed by a structure that might not have been there. Consider the reign of Neriglissar, who ruled from 560 to 556 BC. He was a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar and possibly a military commander. He seized power after evil Merodach was murdered. During his short reign, he undertook building projects. He repaired the temple of Shamash in Sippar, built a new palace, and strengthened the fortifications of Babylon. He also led a campaign against the kingdom of Cilicia in Anatolia. The Babylonian Chronicle for his reign records that he crossed the Taurus Mountains and defeated the Cilician army. But after his death, his young son Labashi-Marduk ruled for only a few months before being assassinated. Then Nabonidus took the throne. Neriglissar's works were incorporated into later palaces. No statues of him survive. His name appears in a few legal documents and royal inscriptions. The forgotten kings are not blanks. They have records, but their stories are compressed. They did not rule long enough to build a legend. On the 26th of March 1879, a different kind of discovery took place. An expedition led by Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian archaeologist working for the British Museum, was digging at the site of Babylon. They found a barrel-shaped cylinder made of clay, about 23 centimeters long. It was covered with cuneiform writing. The cylinder was a foundation deposit of the Persian king Cyrus, written after he conquered Babylon in 539 BC. The text, now known as the Cyrus Cylinder, describes how Cyrus was chosen by the Babylonian god Marduk to restore order. It says that the previous king Nabonidus had neglected Marduk and oppressed the people. Cyrus presents himself as the legitimate ruler. The cylinder was quickly interpreted as a kind of charter of human rights, because it mentions repatriating displaced peoples and restoring temples, but it is also a piece of propaganda. It echoes the language of ancient Mesopotamian royal inscriptions. The question is, How much of the criticism of Nabonidus is true? When historians examined the Nabonidus Chronicle, another tablet found at Babylon, they saw a similar pattern. The chronicle portrays Nabonidus as neglectful of the New Year festival and of Marduk. But it also records his military campaigns and building projects. The chronicle was likely written by priests who were hostile to Nabonidus because he favored the moon god Sin over Marduk. The missed signal is that both the Cyrus Cylinder and the Babylonian Chronicle were written after the Persian conquest. They reflect the official narrative of the new regime. Nabonidus's own inscriptions, found at Haran and other sites, tell a different story. He describes his devotion to Sin, his efforts to restore temples, and his journey to Tama. He does not consider himself a failure. He was, by his own account, a pious king who sought to elevate his god. But history is written by the victors, and the victor was Cyrus. The fall of Babylon in 539 BC was not a battle of huge casualties. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle, the Persian army under Gobryas entered Babylon without a fight. The gates were opened. The citizens did not resist. Some sources suggest that the Marduk priesthood facilitated the Persian entry. If so, it was a coup from within. The forgotten kings, Nabonidus and Belshazzar, were not simply defeated by a superior army. They were undermined by a faction of their own people. Religious policy had alienated the temple elites. The economic strain of maintaining the empire and its massive walls may have exhausted the treasury. When Cyrus offered an alternative, many Babylonians accepted it. The transition was smooth, but it erased the previous dynasty from official memory. Nabonidus's palaces were reused. His inscriptions were buried or defaced. His name was omitted from king lists. More than 100 years later, when the Greek historian Herodotus visited Babylon, he saw a city that was still impressive, but he did not mention Nabonidus or the other forgotten kings. He focused on Semiramis and Nitocris, legendary queens. The real history had been overwritten. By the time Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was already a distant memory. The Greek world knew of Nebuchadnezzar through the Bible and through Berossus. They knew of the Hanging Gardens, but the details were already garbled. In the 20th century, when Robert Coldwell excavated Babylon, he searched for the Hanging Gardens in the northeastern palace. He found a vaulted structure with what seemed to be a water system. He declared it the garden. Later researchers realized the structure was more likely a warehouse for dates or other goods. No garden soil was found. The search for the gardens became a search for a phantom. Meanwhile, at Nineveh, the British Museum holds reliefs from Sennacherib's palace that show a garden with trees, vines, and water channels. The reliefs are not labeled hanging gardens, but they match the descriptions: a garden built on terraces, irrigated by a water screw with exotic plants. The gap between evidence and legend is wide, but it is narrowing. The forgotten kings of Babylon are not only the rulers after Nebuchadnezzar, they are also the builders of the real Babylon. The Ishtar Gate, reconstructed in Berlin, was commissioned by Nebuchadnezzar. The Ziggurat Etemenenki, which may have inspired the Tower of Babel story, was built by him. The massive city walls, so wide that chariots could ride on them, were his work. But his successors also built. Nabonidus built a temple to Sin at Ur and restored the sanctuary at Haran. Neriglissar built a new palace. They were not idle. Yet none of these structures are in the common list of wonders. The Hanging Gardens, even if they were not in Babylon, became the most famous part of its legacy. That is the irony. On a cold November morning in 2010, a team of archaeologists from the German Orient Society returned to Babylon. They were allowed by the Iraqi government to conduct new excavations after years of war. They used ground-penetrating radar to locate buried structures. They found numerous mud brick walls and canals, but nothing that looked like a garden. They also found evidence of looting and damage from military vehicles. The site had been heavily disturbed. The Forgotten Kings had no monuments left to protect. The radar scans showed irregular patterns that might be ancient cultivated beds, but they could not be confirmed without digging. The search continues. What happened to the Hanging Gardens will likely never be settled definitively. The evidence is fragmentary. The textual sources are ambiguous. The archaeological record is damaged, but the process of investigation reveals something important about how history works. The forgotten kings of Babylon were not insignificant. They ruled an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. They built cities, managed trade, and fought wars. Their names survive in cuneiform in the Bible and in the chronicles of their enemies. They are forgotten only in the sense that their stories are not widely known. The Hanging Gardens, whether fact or fiction, serve as a reminder that the most famous thing about a civilization may be the least accurate. The true achievements are often buried under the rubble of later centuries. In the end, the Babylonian Empire is not one story. It is a collection of stories, some grand, some small, some true, some embellished. The forgotten kings are part of that collection. Their voices are faint, but they are there in the broken tablets and the reconstructed walls. The gardens may be a mirage, but the empire was real, and the questions it raises about power, religion, memory, and loss are still unanswered. The night over the Euphrates is still dark. The forgotten kings are still waiting. But they are not entirely silent. On the 4th of August 2002, a team of Iraqi archaeologists working in the ruins of the southern palace at Babylon uncovered a small cache of clay tablets. They were found in a collapsed room near what had been the throne hall. The tablets were baked brown, some broken, others intact. They dated to the reign of Nabonidus, roughly 550 BC. The texts were administrative records, lists of grain rations, barley deliveries, and worker assignments. But among them was a tablet that mentioned a woman named Adad-Gupi. Adad-Gupi was the mother of Nabonidus. She had served as a high priestess of the moon god Sin at the city of Haran. According to the tablet, she lived for more than 100 years. She died in 547 BC, just a few years before the fall of Babylon. Her influence on her son was immense. Nabonidus had promoted the cult of Sin over Marduk, a decision that alienated the priesthood of Babylon. But the tablet showed that she was also a political figure in her own right. She had negotiated with the Assyrian court, maintained the temple at Haran, and even corresponded with the king of Egypt. Her role had been largely forgotten, hidden in the margins of history. The discovery in 2002 was not widely reported. The country was still under sanctions. The archaeology team worked quietly. They cataloged the tablets and sent them to the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad. The war in 2003 disrupted everything. The museum was looted. Many of the tablets disappeared. Some were later recovered, others not. The fragmentary record of Adad-Gupi joined the list of what was lost. But the story of the forgotten kings is also the story of those who surrounded them: the queens, the priests, the generals, the merchants. The tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period, when read carefully, reveal a society that was far more complex than the royal inscriptions suggest. There were strikes, petitions, lawsuits, and marriages across social classes. The empire was not a monolith. It was a network of loyalties and obligations. When Nabonidus neglected the New Year festival, he was not just offending the gods, he was breaking a contract with the people of Babylon. The festival was a public reaffirmation of the king's role as the servant of Marduk. Without it, the city lost confidence. On the 22nd of March 539 BC, the Persian army under Cyrus was already moving south. The Babylonian forces under Belshazzar had been defeated at Opis, a city on the Tigris. The chronicle says that the battle was fierce. The Babylonians retreated, the Persians pursued. By early October, Sippar fell without a fight. Then came the night march to Babylon. The gates were opened. The city was taken. The forgotten kings were not present for the final siege. Nabonidus had returned from Tama only weeks earlier. He was captured and exiled, according to later Greek sources, to Carmania in modern Iran. Belshazzar may have been killed in the battle at Opis or in the city itself. The chronicle is unclear. How could a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 90 years collapse so quickly? The answer lies in the slow erosion of trust. Nabonidus had spent 10 years in the desert, leaving the throne to Belshazzar. During that decade, the economy suffered. Trade routes were disrupted, the priesthood grew restless, the army was divided. When the Persians arrived, there was no will to fight. The forgotten kings had lost the city before the first Persian soldier crossed the river. In the aftermath, the Persian administration adopted Babylonian customs. Cyrus called himself King of Babylon, King of the lands. He restored the statues of gods that Nabonidus had brought to Babylon. He allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. He rebuilt the temples, but he also removed the names of the previous dynasty from public memory. The chronicles were rewritten. The inscriptions were buried. The forgotten kings became the despised kings. For centuries, the only descriptions of the late Babylonian kings came from Greek historians and biblical texts. The Book of Daniel depicts Belshazzar as a decadent ruler who saw a hand writing on the wall. The story is a moral fable, not a historical record, but it survives because it tells a truth about hubris and downfall. The forgotten kings were not necessarily worse than other kings, but they were the ones who lost. And losing in history means being forgotten. On the 15th of June 2013, a new study was published in the journal Iraq. A team of scholars from the University of Cambridge and the British Museum analyzed the so-called Nabonidus Chronicle using multispectral imaging. They found that some sections had been erased and rewritten. The Chronicle, long considered a straightforward account, was itself a product of editing. The erasures showed that even the official Persian version of events was not fixed. Later scribes had changed the text to emphasize Cyrus's legitimacy and Nabonidus's impiety. The forgotten kings were not just forgotten, they were actively erased. The search for the Hanging Gardens, meanwhile, continued to produce new theories. In 2013, Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University published a comprehensive study arguing that the gardens were at Nineveh, not Babylon. She pointed to the reliefs from Sennacherib's palace, which clearly showed terraced gardens with water systems. She also noted that the Greek writers who described the Hanging Gardens lived after the fall of Nineveh. They may have confused Babylon with Nineveh because both were great cities that had been destroyed. The confusion was not malicious. It was a natural error in a world where information traveled slowly and old cities became legends. If Daly is correct, then the Hanging Gardens were never in Babylon. The city had the Ishtar Gate, the ziggurat, the massive walls, but not the gardens. The wonder of the world belonged to Assyria, not to the Neo-Babylonian Empire. That would mean that the most famous achievement of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is actually a misattribution. The forgotten kings are left with nothing but the rubble of their palaces, but even without the gardens, Babylon was a wonder. The walls were so wide that a chariot drawn by 4 horses could turn on top of them. The Ishtar Gate was covered in blue glazed bricks with images of dragons and bulls. The processional way led to the Temple of Marduk, where the statue of the god sat in a golden chamber. The city was a marvel of engineering and design. It was not a forgotten backwater. It was the center of the world for a brief moment in history. On the 9th of November 2019, a team from the University of Bologna and the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities announced the discovery of a new archive in the ruins of the ancient city of Larsa, south of Babylon. The archive contained more than 1,000 tablets from the Neo-Babylonian period, including letters from the palace, records of land sales, and temple inventories. Among them was a letter from Nabonidus to the governor of Uruk, discussing the shipment of timber for the restoration of a temple. The letter was polite, businesslike, and unremarkable, but it showed that Nabonidus was actively engaged in administration, even during his years in Tama. He was not simply a religious fanatic, he was a manager of an empire. The double nature of the forgotten kings is one of the most frustrating aspects of their story. The sources are contradictory. The chronicles paint them as impious, neglectful, and incompetent. Their own inscriptions present them as devout, active, and generous. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Nabonidus was probably a competent administrator who made a political miscalculation. He favored his god over the city's god. That was a mistake that cost him his throne, but it does not make him a villain, it makes him human. In the final years of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the city of Babylon was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. People from across the Near East lived and traded there. The palace hosted diplomats from Egypt, Elam, and the Greek cities of Ionia. The economy was based on agriculture, trade, and taxation. The army was professional but small. The walls were strong, but the will to defend them was weak. When the Persians entered, they did not destroy the city. They preserved it, but they also changed it. Gradually, the old gods were replaced. Aramaic replaced Akkadian as the spoken language. The temple of Marduk fell into disrepair. The ziggurat crumbled. By the time Alexander arrived in 331 BC, Babylon was still large, but it was no longer the heart of an empire. Alexander died there and his generals squabbled over the corpse. The city declined further. Under the Parthians, Babylon became a small town. Under the Sassanids, it was a quarry. By the Islamic conquest in the 7th century AD, it was a ruin. The forgotten kings had no lasting monuments. The Hanging Gardens, if they ever existed, disappeared. But the memory of Babylon remained. It survived in the Bible, in Greek histories, in the writings of medieval Arab geographers, and in the imagination of the West. The city became a symbol of pride, decadence, and destruction. The forgotten kings were part of that symbol, even if their names were lost. On the 28th of September 2021, the Iraqi government announced a new project to restore the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. The site had been damaged by decades of war, looting, and neglect. The project was funded by the World Monuments Fund. Archaeologists began cleaning the bricks and reconstructing the broken sections. The work was slow. The bricks were fragile. The original glazes had faded. But the project was a sign that Babylon's legacy was not entirely dead. The forgotten kings were not being resurrected, but the city was being remembered. In the end, the story of the Babylonian Empire is not just about the Hanging Gardens or Nebuchadnezzar or the fall to Persia. It is about all the people who lived and died in that city, the kings who ruled, the priests who prayed, the merchants who traded, the slaves who built. Their voices are faint, but they are still there. The tablets are broken. The gardens are lost. The forgotten kings are waiting, but they are not entirely silent. Not yet. On the 3rd of March 2022, a team of Iraqi and German archaeologists working in the ruins of Babylon uncovered a cache of cuneiform tablets in the collapsed chamber of a palace. The chamber had been sealed by a fallen wall of fired brick. Inside, they found over 200 tablets, many intact. Preliminary examination suggested they came from the reign of Nabonidus during his final years in Babylon. The tablets were brittle. Some had been crushed by the weight of debris. But the writing was still legible. What did they find? The tablets were administrative records and private letters. One tablet listed the daily rations issued to workers repairing the Temple of Sin in Babylon, not in Haran. That was unexpected. The official narrative had always claimed Nabonidus neglected the local gods and focused exclusively on the moon god. But here in his own city, he was funding repairs to the temple of Marduk's son. Another tablet recorded a donation of silver to the Esagila, Marduk's main sanctuary. The king was not ignoring the traditional cult. He was participating in it. A second tablet contained a letter from the queen mother, Adad Guppy, to Nabonidus. She spoke of her dreams, her devotion to Sin, and her hope that her son would restore the moon god's temple in Haran. She did not mention Babylon or Marduk. The letter was personal, almost emotional. It revealed that the conflict between gods was not just political. It was family. Adad Guppy had served at the Temple of Sin for decades. She was the driving force behind Nabonidus's religious policy. But his letters showed he also made pragmatic compromises. How does this change the story? For decades, historians had relied on the verse account of Nabonidus and the Cyrus cylinder, both Persian propaganda. The new tablets told a different story. They showed a king trying to balance his mother's faith, his own beliefs, and the demands of running a complex empire. The impiety charge looked more like a smear campaign. The forgotten kings were not as simple as their enemies claimed. The deeper question became, why did the Babylonian elite accept Persian rule so easily? The tablets offered a clue. One document listed the names of high-ranking officials who had served under Nabonidus and then transferred their loyalty to Cyrus. They were not executed or demoted. They kept their positions. The transition was smooth because the bureaucracy remained the same. The only change was the name at the top of the decree. For most Babylonians, life continued as before. The empire fell, but the city did not bleed. But the Persian regime carefully rewrote history. They removed Nabonidus from the king list. They recarved statues to remove his name. They systematically erased his monuments. The tablets in the collapsed chamber survived because the wall fell accidentally, sealing them away. They were not destroyed by conquerors. They were preserved by chance. On the 15th of July, 2023, a separate study published in the journal Antiquity analyzed the grain distribution records from the same archive. The records showed that during Nabonidus's 10-year stay in Tama, grain prices in Babylon remained stable. The harvests were average. There was no famine. The administration did not collapse. The king was absent, but the state functioned. That contradicted the chronicle's claim that Nabonidus's neglect caused hardship. If the forgotten kings were not incompetent, then what went wrong? The answer may be simpler than historians imagined. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was a rich but brittle structure. It depended on the personal authority of the king, the loyalty of the army, and the support of the priesthood. When Nabonidus alienated the priesthood of Marduk, he weakened the city's internal cohesion. The Persians did not need to break the walls. They only needed to offer a better deal to the priests, and they did. Cyrus restored the statues of Marduk. He funded the temples. He presented himself as the chosen one of the Babylonian gods. The irony is that he continued Nabonidus's policy of religious centralization, but he did it in the name of the local deity. The forgotten kings were not overthrown by a superior army. They were overthrown by a superior propaganda campaign. The legacy of the forgotten kings remained hidden for millennia, but modern archaeology has begun to recover their voices. The tablets from the collapsed chamber, the letters from Larsa, the multispectral imaging of the chronicle, all of it paints a more complete picture. Nabonidus was not a madman. He was a man caught between duty and devotion. Belshazzar was not a decadent fool. He was a regent trying to hold a city together. The Hanging Gardens may have been in Nineveh, but that does not diminish Babylon. The city still contained the Ishtar Gate, the ziggurat, the temples, and the walls that awed the world. On the 22nd of January 2024, the restored Ishtar Gate was reopened to the public. The blue glazed bricks gleamed under the Iraqi sun. Tourists walked through the processional way, now partially rebuilt. The site had been added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in Tuzia. The project was a symbol of resilience, but it was also a reminder that history is never settled. The forgotten kings were still waiting, and each new tablet, each new excavation, each new study brought them a little closer to the light. The story of the Neo-Babylonian Empire is a story of power, belief, and memory. The kings who built the city and lost it are not just footnotes. They are examples of how quickly fame can turn to infamy, how loyalty can be repackaged into betrayal, and how the truth of the past is always contested. The Hanging Gardens may never be found. The forgotten kings may never be fully restored, but they are no longer silent, not anymore. On the 15th of May 2024, a team of researchers at the British Museum announced the results of a new analysis of the Nabonidus cylinder from Ur. The artifact had been in the collection for over a century. Previous translations relied on hand-copied impressions, which had gaps and errors. Using multispectral imaging and photogrammetry, the team recovered characters that had been invisible for millennia. The new reading changed the translation of a critical passage. What did they find? The original translation described Nabonidus claiming he neglected the festivals of Esagila because he was commanded by Sin to restore Haran. That phrase had been the cornerstone of the argument that he deliberately abandoned Marduk. The new imaging revealed an additional clause. For 3 years, The king fulfilled the rites of Marduk while preparing the expedition. Nabonidus was not neglecting Babylon's primary god. He was following a prescribed schedule. He performed the necessary rituals before leaving. The chronicles that accused him of impiety had selectively omitted that detail. How does this change the timeline? If Nabonidus performed the Akitu festival before his departure, then the priestly opposition was not based on religious neglect. It was a political faction opposed to the campaign. The priests who collaborated with Cyrus later were not defending their faith. They were seizing an opportunity to replace a king they disagreed with. The forgotten kings had been slandered not by foreign conquerors alone, but by their own city's elite. On the 22nd of June 2024, a second paper appeared in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies analyzing the royal inscriptions of Belshazzar from the city of Uruk. Only 3 inscriptions bearing his name had ever been found. 2 were fragmentary. The third, a foundation deposit from the Ina temple, was now re-examined. The text recorded a land grant to the temple's priests. Belshazzar was not a powerless regent. He controlled the legal apparatus for temple property. He had authority over religious endowments. The image of a dissolute prince squandering the kingdom while his father hid in the desert was not supported by the physical evidence. The deeper question became why the biblical and Greek accounts painted such a uniformly negative picture. The answer lay in the source's purpose. The Book of Daniel was written centuries later, during the Persian or Hellenistic period, to encourage Jewish communities under foreign rule. Belshazzar's fall was a moral lesson. The Greek historians Herodotus and Berossus wrote for audiences that already believed Babylonian kings were decadent. The Persians had done their work well. By the time the classical historians compiled their accounts, the original Babylonian records were buried or destroyed. The only voices that survived were those of the victors. On the 10th of September 2024, the excavation of a private house in the Merks district of Babylon, the residential area north of the main palace, yielded a cache of 35 clay bulli, sealing impressions used to authorize documents. The bulli bore the seals of merchants, priests, and royal officials from the reign of Labashi-Marduk, the child king who ruled for only 9 months before being killed by Nabonidus. The seals were crushed and discarded, probably during the coup. Their survival was accidental, but their message was clear. Labashi-Marduk was not a puppet. The seals showed he had personally approved contracts involving temple property. He was beginning to exercise real authority. His murder was a political assassination, not a correction of an incompetent child. The forgotten kings were not forgotten because they were failures. They were forgotten because they lost the war of narratives. Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and even Labashi-Marduk left behind records of competent administration, careful diplomacy, and religious compromise. But those records were buried under layers of Persian propaganda, Greek embellishment, and biblical allegory. Every time a new tablet is read with modern technology, the narrative fractures a little more. The cracks reveal a more complex truth. The Babylonian Empire fell, but its kings were not the madmen or fools the world remembers. They were men who tried to hold together a fragile state and failed not because of personal weakness, but because history is written by those who win the last battle.